Welcome, Tomás.
Hi, thank you very much for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Sure, I'd like to welcome our third speaker in this series of speakers in this afternoon, this late afternoon. And this is Tomás Dodds from the University of Amsterdam. And the title of his talk today is Citizen-Generated Fact-Checking Platforms, Outgrowing Failing Media Infrastructures. And just one more reminder to our participants that to ask questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and I will read the questions out. But Tomás, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sure.
Can I share my screen?
Yes.
Is everything okay?
Yep.
Sorry for my voice is a little gone. I've been teaching today for 6 hours already. But yeah, as you said, the title of my talk is Citizen-Generated Fact-Checking Platforms, Outgrowing Failing Mediatic Infrastructures. And what I want to talk about today is how certain journalistic projects that were started by media itself came to perhaps the rescue of journalists who were struggling to cover or to deal with everything that happened during the October Revolution in Chile, as it has come to be called. Which came with the outgrowth of an interconnected ecology of online information, gathering, fact-checking, and news reporting platforms produced by organized citizen journalists. We can discuss what that means, and digital activists for sure. So by conducting interviews with the creators of two of these projects, what I want to do here is to identify the strategies and practices developed by civil society to fight against the disinformation and fake news that were permeating during October and the following months, both the media and the civic environment in the context of social unrest. So let's keep one. So probably, as you have read in the news for sure, since mid-October of 2019, Chile has been in the grips of waves of anti-government protests and cultural manifestations, with tens of thousands of demonstrators taking to the street to protest across the country. So for some, the upsurge of these social outbursts has its roots in a civil society rebelling against an uncaring economic and political elite that has effectively ruled the country since its return to democracy in 1990. For some authors, Chileans are rebelling against the commodification of humanity, but we can talk about that as well later. Of course, what started as a protest against recent fare hikes in the public subway system quickly escalated when Sebastián Piñera's right-wing administration decided to decree state of emergency and instituted martial law in the country's largest cities, making the military forces who were not trained to deal with civilians responsible for quelling the protest. As expected, unrestrained repression was followed by public outrage, which in turn only produced a groundswell of political support for the uprising, and soon enough, the number of protesters in the streets were skyrocketing. By the end of October of that year, over 1 million people were gathering in the plazas of the capital city of Santiago, and many more took to the streets in other Chilean provinces. So after months of mobilization, clashes between police and demonstrators have left over 3,000 people injured and 20 more have died. This adds to reports by several national and foreign organizations that are proving systematic and gross human rights violations in the country during the riots. So, sorry, that's the context. That's where we start. But something else was happening at the same time. So as the coverage of the horrors that were taking place on the streets emerged in the form of an endless live broadcast, the audience was faced with the challenge of identifying and combating the menace of fake news on social networks as well. The ever-present, if you want, dissemination of disinformation this time was not only caused by faceless bots operating on the margins of popular platforms. This time, they also came down from the top of the national government, intentionally sponsored by high-ranking political figures. So in December of 2019, Piñera claimed in an interview with international media that some of the videos that people were seeing on their feeds were actually fake news, or that many of them have been filmed outside of Chile or misrepresented. And indeed, this type of message that some of the things you are seeing on your screen might not be real, isn't it difficult to disprove? Either by political or technological limitations, national televisions and newspapers as well were unable to fact-check the sheer volume of videos and pictures circulating on multiple social networks, right? So during the first months of the movement, the screens of millions of Chileans show nothing more but supermarket lootings or barricades on flames. And then the videos of police abuse were mostly relegated to independent left-wing digital media, which often at the same time was unqualified or unfit to track down the sources of all the material that came from the streets and that now were piling on their, to be honest, small newsrooms. This is the context, right? So discontented with the manner that in which traditional media were covering such abuses, if they were reporting on them at all, a variety of bottom-up grassroots journalistic projects started emerging from the efforts of reporters and other media professionals currently working, and this is important, outside traditional news organizations, right? So only 4 days, this is the first of the projects I'm going to talk about, only 4 days after the beginning of the protest in Chile, so really fast, ChileRegistra started. It was a crowdsourcing repository of audiovisual material and information regarding the ongoing protest. Although neither of the founders work in news organizations anymore, they have some experience. The idea came from noticing how their former colleagues who were working on traditional media organizations were failing to include material from social networks in their coverage. And the structure with which they will work is as simple as this. It was a Google Drive followed by a WhatsApp group where people will organize, they will identify videos or pictures that were circulated on social media, and they will try to track down who the authors of this material, who was the author, right? This is one of the quotes from my interviews with one of the founders, and he says, "We both have friends inside big media institutions, and talking to them, we realized that they were completely overwhelmed by the quantity of the information and that they did not have any infrastructure to collect, to store, and verify social media material in order to integrate it into their coverage." And what's the problem? So by obviating the material that was available on social networks, traditional media created a gap, however brief, between what newspapers and television stations show and what the audience was seeing on their social platform. Traditional media could not show the videos of human rights violations that had been shared on social networks simply because they were unable to verify the sheer volume of the material reaching the news. If you want, it was a materiality problem here. For one of the founders, and I'm quoting here, this is due to the fact that today in Chilean media, there are no departments for data journalism or audience studies or fact-checking. There are practically none of the minimum departments that a digital media outlet needs in 2020. I'm sure that even though this is in the Chilean context, perhaps it's something that we can replicate for other contexts as well. So while users' feeds on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well were filling with images showing atrocities committed by military personnel, media outlets would primarily broadcast live images all the time in a 24/7 loop of riots and barricades, which later, the only thing that it did was to produce a higher level of mistrust between the demonstrators and the press. So journalists are starting to be kicked out of the protests, people will not talk to them, and perhaps even in worse cases, they got attacked. So the objectives of ChileRegistra were very clear. It had two main purposes. Firstly, to create what they call a super database with photos and videos of the protesters, including military and police abuses. Secondly, to identify the creators of the videos and photos already posted and shared on social networks in order to make these users available, one, as news sources, and two, as witness for both traditional media and legal prosecutors. They have another concern that they didn't make explicit, but I got it from my interviews, that was precisely responded to the ephemeral properties of social networks. As it has happened before, and sometimes in much worse cases, sensible audio-video material of human rights violations is often erased from social media platforms, either by users denouncing the content as improper or due to the search engines used to find violent material becoming increasingly efficient. So ChileRegistra aims to safeguard these videos and pictures so they can be used later for citizens, the press, and of course by human rights organizations. So basically this is how they will work. The first step that they make a public call. If you have videos, please upload them. And then if you don't have videos but you want to participate, help us find who the authors of these videos are. So an interesting characteristic of this project is for sure its relation with traditional media and its journalists. I think I leave the quote here for lack of time, so I don't go too long, but basically they talk about how difficult it was to create bridges with traditional media, how they were rejected for journalists who basically said, well, what do you mean that you're bringing information to us, or you're bringing a database to us? Why should we believe this is well done or this is actually accurate? So one of the quotes I really like is, losing a little bit of the journalistic monopoly on decision making is something with which this industry still struggles a lot. So the second project I want to focus on, and I think we're okay with time, it's FastCheck. This says Bill Gates is the owner of the World Health Organization. Well, that's fake, just in case you're wondering. But FastCheck is a fact-check initiative based on Instagram that gained over 100,000 followers during their first active month and now has over 70,000 more. It was paradoxically created by a group of journalism graduates who have never worked on media organizations before and relied on volunteers and non-paying experts to check and report on the veracity of the information that they were trying to analyze. One of the founders who created and currently directs this project explained during our interview the benefits of using this particular device to engage with an hyper-connected audience. And I think this is a quote which perhaps something we can talk about is the platform, the use of platforms during context of social unrest. But he says, the social uprising opened the door for this type of products. In particular, the design made people really like how they receive the information. It is quick and easy to read. Today, everyone spends a lot of time on Instagram. So the decision to occupy this platform to do fact-checking was the right one, because there were fact-check projects on web pages or Twitter, but they did not work very well. The user experience was key here. And this is interesting because they're not all of them are journalists, but part of the members of this group were designers, something we will talk about later. So do vaccines against coronavirus modify your genetic material? That also fake, just in case. So FastCheck became widely known after a news segment on the national television station in Chile show image of a bank being consumed by flames amidst the mass revolts. After users on social media started sounding the alarm that the pictures that they were seeing were actually exaggerated, FastCheck was able to prove that although there indeed had been a fire in that pharmacy or bank, most of the blaze that people saw on their screens had been added digitally. So by mistake, the television station picked up images online from the fire, but it was images that had been digitally modified, and then the flames were exaggerated. So it's really interesting because this is a quote from one of the founders. He says, because we do not have the level of expertise on video editing, we just openly ask on social media for experts, and we actually received several people who were interested in collaborating. We end up choosing, because of his curriculum, an expert that was actually in Argentina and that was able to help us online. Battling this information is but a collective endeavor for FastCheck. So since none of the members of this group or this team are actually journalists, or a very well-trained writer, the information was presented, as you can see, in simple bullet points, which they argue now people end up enjoying more than long blocks of text. And since the bank fire incident, the project has been deemed reliable, not only by the audience that follows them on Instagram, but also by other journalists. Faster than they expected, FastCheck started to receive invitations to participate on news segments. For a while, they were invited regularly to a television show where they were asked to identify which of the news that had been circulating around WhatsApp on the last 24 hours were real, which were fake. And then the strangest thing occurred when, unlike ChileRegistra, who faced some opposition, FastCheck started being prized by other journalists and media workers. When I asked the founder of this project why he thought this happened, he said, if you want to see it as a binary, and I'm quoting here, we check both news for right-wing and left-wing audience. We had people writing to us saying, I thought you were on my side, but no, we do not belong to any side. We're just publishing the information that we are able to check and that we believe people should be aware of. So the main goal of FastCheck for its founders is to generate a methodology that is at the same time bulletproof and transparent, where the audience is able to see and understand how they follow their research process of fact-checking and how they categorize the content. This is particularly relevant to understand the importance of transparency in collective digital initiatives, I will argue. So these are some of the preliminary results I'm working with in this research. And here I'm quoting some authors that argue that in making transparency a shared exercise, like these initiatives do, what they're doing is calling forth ideal subjects as active witnesses, who to some degree take responsibility for ensuring moral futures. Transparency and accountability in the creation of these structures of resistance is not a coincidence. Their legitimacy precondition to even attempt to fight fake news and disinformation is given by the disposition and collaboration possibilities that reside in the audience. Perhaps because of the former, the most interesting element of analysis regarding the transparency and hypervigilance of a project such as FastCheck is its content denial of being referred to as an activist or even as a journalist. Half serious, half joking, its creator comment that perhaps the correct term that they should be referred to as is an activist of journalism, which perhaps is something we can discuss also later. In here, I argue that these initiatives are not only mere pseudo-journalistic projects, but they function actually as reactive transparency devices. So what they're doing is calling on citizens to participate, to be active and vigilant in response to the newly accessible data. What this project seems to be doing is successfully anticipating the failure of the media industry by getting ahead of their shortcomings, especially on issues related to false information. By identifying sources and correctly labeling material, for example, ChileRegistra is making sure to reduce the possible spaces for disinformation. They are calling on journalists' own self-proclaimed standards and ethics against the purveyors of disinformation. FastCheck, on the other hand, what they're doing is making the process of fact-checking both popular and transparent, incentivizing citizens to actively participate. FastCheck, if you want, in some way, is at the same time legitimizing a dichotomic position of true or false and creating a knowledge space that is free, that is easy to access, and that is easy to corroborate. These projects constantly create and update preventive infrastructure based on available public data, relying on citizens to be source, to be producers, to be fact checkers of their own experiences on the street. Yeah, so by anticipating this information, I also argue that, and something we can discuss, is that these projects have created a spirit of togetherness between what one of the founders called activists of journalism and collaborative activists and the audience themselves. It is perhaps the cluster of activists and audience, the congregation of different profiles and professionals, one of the biggest impacts that these projects have had over the Chilean society in particular. I say that a slight tinge of sameness hovers over the relationships of those involved in citizen-generated reporting, tearing down traditional journalistic structures and opening new horizontal spaces for community collaboration. And just to finish, although the ways in which these organizations operate seems to reinforce the hegemony of traditional media in context of conflict, as a journalistic ethos hovers over the way that these initiatives understand themselves and operate, these proxy-orientated projects also shed some light into digital activists' ability to create structures of resistance in order to politically engage in the production of news and fight against both institutional and organic disinformation. If anything, the cases of ChileRegistra and FastCheck show that Chile live or is living, perhaps, a period of revolutionary hope where citizens can make meaningful contributions and are growing, as many other digital activists around the world, increasingly aware of the critical role of information as the new fabric of social life. That's a quote. As the country had literally overnight entered a state of emergency with a government that saw its legitimacy further in peril, the failures of losing themselves in a sea of fake news will have been the responsibility of the citizens, who can always have been more active, more vigilant, more participatory. And so what I argue here today is that Chilean activists and citizen reporters fought back. The disinformation that came down from political spheres of power, unchecked and uncontested for the longest time by a constantly shifting traditional media due to, if you want, socio-technical and political limitations, was repelled with a structure that refused to be rolled back, and instead, by using the most rudimentary of all the technologies available, they resisted. Some questions arise from this, though, and perhaps is what we can discuss now. So what does it mean for journalists and journalism when citizens and activists are actively doing part of a job that they seem unable to do? Why is there no space in newsroom for tasks and, by extension, values that seem hyper necessary in the world we live in? And perhaps the most important for me, and I think I have a little bit of time, is perhaps we talk a lot about in the literature that journalistic values have changed. Some people will argue that they have disappeared, but perhaps it's not that journalistic values have died, because there seem to be alive among the audience and independent reporters as well. It just simply seems that there's no space for them in newsrooms anymore. So that is it for me. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Tomás. We have some questions here for you. So I'm going to just go through them one by one. I have a question of my own as well, but let's start with the first question from Mark, which is, other than FastCheck, what do you regard as the most valuable international fact-checking sites?
That's an interesting question, and I think they were based on the interesting thing about FastCheck in particular is that they were copying different projects, and I think I'm trying to remember the name of the Mexican one they were based on, but basically it would be a very try and learn experience where they will, for example, try to copy certain categories from other fact check platforms and see what works with this particular public and with this and in this context. And one of the interesting things is that something perhaps we don't always think about is that they can, at the point of the interview, they can only do a true or false dichotomic kind of approach, because in order to do more, in order to be, for example, I think the New York Times sometimes does like an imprecise, or kind of true, or any other variable that you want to, or categorization that you want to add, that necessarily requires more expertise, right? So they can only deal with topics that were either being able to classify as either true or false, just because of the capacity that they have to actually test this news. And yeah, and I think the Mexican was Chequea. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it.
Okay. Thank you. And we have our next question here, which is, what's your recipe of checking information in media? Like, what's for the first step should we start with? Is it with headings? Is it with photos? Is it with comments? Like, where does fact checking ideally begin?
I honestly, sorry, my boss is just going. I don't know because these projects were not about checking media, and that's what's interesting. This project, what they were trying to do, we were trying to aid, if anything, they were trying to aid media in their fact checking. So what perhaps I was not clear, but what they saw, both of them, not being journalists, was that media was struggling to cover this information. They simply couldn't do it. It's not they didn't want to do it. They couldn't do it for materiality reasons, the infrastructure they were operating under, the training that their journalists had prior to the revolution. And what these people do is that's what I say, that they recognize certain still hegemony on the media, because they were not trying to replace media. They were trying to assist it. They were trying to complement it. So they went with the database to journalists and tried to convince journalists to use the database. ChileRegistra had more problems. But eventually, for example, remember that claim of Piñera saying some of the things you're seeing are fake news, or others have been recorded outside of Chile? Well, by using the database of ChileRegistra, Publimetro, which is a Swedish tabloid, if I'm not wrong, it's an international tabloid that is in Chile. Publimetro actually wrote an article disproving Piñera and say, no, all the videos that you're seeing on social media are here, and we can identify who the author was, when was it recorded, where was it recorded. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer to your question. Probably there's someone who is better prepared, but the point was not to check media in itself, but try to assist media in this context.
Thank you. We have a third question here from Julian. How do projects like FastCheck go into 2021 and into the future? What are features of technologies that will make these programs more accessible and evolve them for the future of social media and news?
That is an amazing question, because there is a discrepancy between ChileRegistra and FastCheck. So ChileRegistra was meant to be a temporary project. They knew they were going to be born 3 days after the beginning of the revolutions, and they knew they were going to end in a couple of months, because it was unsustainable also for the creators to keep this project going. So they knew it was going to end. And that's basically what they do, is in a very utilitarian approach. They create this database, and then they basically throw the database to different newsrooms, some international newsrooms as well. And then they say, okay, our job is done. FastCheck, on the other hand, what they were trying to, and they're still trying to do, is to grow. As I mentioned before, in order to have more categories of if something is true or false or imprecise, you need to have more experts who kind of can tell all the grays of a story, right? So FastCheck today is looking for support, and they're looking for funding in order to expand as a website as well, to have a newsletter system. They remain, of course, in Instagram is their main entryway, but yeah, they're trying to expand, not only on the platforms, but on the content that are able to analyze as well.
I've got a question, and that has to do with the protection under the law. One of the things, I wrote a lot about WikiLeaks, about 8-9 years ago, started writing about them. And of course, one of the interesting issues as Assange faces possible extradition to the United States, about the fact that his servers were located here in Sweden, is the definition of a news organization or an organization that's conducting journalism, and what the law, what protection the law can offer them. So one of the things when we talk about pseudo-journalism or organizations that are in this gray zone between activism and journalism, is WikiLeaks a news organization? Are they journalists? Are they basically intermediaries in the journalistic process? It becomes incredibly important, the legal definition of these organizations, for the protection that they're offered under the law. And in Chile, like, what would this organization be offered any protection whatsoever as a journalistic organization?
No, not at all. They were NGOs at most. But I mean, no, legally, no protection at all. Professionally, they were doing the job of a journalist. Undoubtedly, they were doing the job that they thought journalists were not doing. And they were doing it without perhaps they were doing it without being so cynical of say, we are journalists, we're doing your job. We're trying to say, okay, you cannot do your job. Here you go. Let me help you. Let me give you a hand so you can do it better. But they have no protection whatsoever until this day. And they basically risk it by themselves. It was perhaps it's worth taking notice that it was a moment of complete chaos in the country, with militaries going on the streets, which we haven't seen since the dictatorship in that ended in 1989. So it was a scenario of complete chaos, and these people, not being able to do something else that they decided to do it. And I mean, one of the funny things is that kind of activists that join. So eventually they got journalists joining, journalism students as well. But for example, in ChileRegistra, one of the people that joined was a grandma. I have it on my interview. And she was just a grandma who wrote and said, like, I don't know what to do. I'm watching the news and I know the news because what my grandsons are telling me is not showing what is happening on the street. How can I help? And they basically gave her like videos, and she like was trying to identify where the videos had occurred, right? So where the human rights violations were happening. So yeah, I mean, there was a grandma was perhaps doing the job you would have expect from anyone in a newsroom with access to whatever technology is available.
And another legal question I have is this. You of course know the legal change in France where filming police officers has become criminalized. And the response to that was quite strong in Paris and other parts of France. And I'm just wondering, first of all, what the law is in Chile on that. And we've seen in other countries, I'm talking about where I've lived. I lived for 5 years in Turkey as well. So what you see is states criminalizing acts of journalism in order precisely to dissuade the filming and the distribution of this material, and also putting pressure on social media companies to take down material. Turkey is very famous for doing that. So I'm just wondering in Chile, what the legal situation is with filming acts of violence by the police, A, and B, if you see organizations like this that are fact-checking these massive amounts of videos, if the possibility is you think we're going to see far more countries do what France did, which is to criminalize the act of actually filming violence.
Yeah, so today in Chile, you're able to film police at any point that you want. The gray area is you cannot interfere with an arrest, for example. So what they will argue is that when you're too close filming, they will take your phone away because you were interfering with the arrest. In practice, there is open human rights violations against people filming. We have seen the videos because people were streaming live, for example. But one of the good things that have happened is by law, policemen need to have their name tag on their chest at all times. And it happened a lot during these months that their name tags were hidden. So with this footage, some people, including these organizations, what they were trying to do was to identify these policemen or army men on the streets. Will it happen something like France? How to know? Chile has been today. It's been more because immediately after the revolution, COVID happened. So it's been for over a year in a state of emergency with military restrictions and so on. So it's very uncertain. There was a political movement that finished eventually with the voting of a new constitution that it will happen in a couple of months. But I don't know. But what, for example, precisely the ephemeral part of social media is what ChileRegistra was trying to prevent, this idea that videos or social media companies so easily give in to governments censoring content. So what ChileRegistra was precisely trying to, they knew that social media would be a temporary home for these videos. Because as you said, Turkey happens and other contexts happens as well, where they just, the government just keeps the order and then this material gets deleted. So they were just using it as a temporary tool to collect these videos.
And we have 30 seconds left, but just, are there any worries about retributions of the people taking the videos if they put them up on these things, that they can be, because that's what's happened in some other countries, that people who have filmed videos have found themselves to be under surveillance by authorities?
Not necessarily, because, and I said this honestly, that will imply that Chile has an intelligence committee, which it does not. I don't know how to say it differently, but it's constantly under hacking. For example, they keep every time they have people passing by civilians in the protest, they found them. Their intelligence agencies in Chile are not very intelligent.
Oh, okay.
So
Tomás,
not necessarily.
Okay. Tomás, thank you very much. I think it's exactly 6:35. So I'd just like to thank you and thank all the speakers from this last cluster of speakers. It's been really excellent, and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you very much for having me.
Sure.